We should really start to have entrance music for this.
Good.
We need what?
Entrance
Intro?
music.
Oh, yes.
Like we need an
Yes.
intro.
I like wrestling,
Like the Undertaker's theme song?
Yeah.
Right.
But the old school one.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to... Hey!
Thank you,
Hello, everybody.
Thank you.
Welcome to a wonderful reunion with my
Glad to be
friends.
back.
Welcome to another Tattooed Historian Presents here at the Gary Owen Irish Pub, live in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We have 3 live streams going on again. This is incredible. So thanks, guys, for watching on there. I know we have watch parties going on in certain
with
areas
history
of the
things with
country.
Pat, Tattooed Historian, Battles and Banter. What's up, everybody?
I was going to do my own shout out,
Yeah,
but thanks.
He's going to help us with the shout outs.
I appreciate the hair.
But thank you all for coming out this evening. As we go through the evening, the lighting gets better and better, but we don't get better looking the whole evening,
No.
so it's okay.
You're stuck.
I did my best.
Yeah. But some of you may have watched all 3 of us when we did WTF Moments of the Civil War. Yeah. So yeah, that was big, right?
Thank you.
That was an Emmy Award-winning process there.
We're famous now.
Yes.
Us
So
famous.
we thought about for this evening doing WTF moments in history, so that way we're not just cornering ourselves in one era of history. We can do a wild card and do whatever we like and take something out of history that's a little bit different. Maybe doesn't fit into the area that we're sitting in right now, but it's something cool and that we've come across throughout our times as historians and whatever level we're at. So joining me again is obviously Mr. Avery Lentz.
Hello, everybody.
Battles and Banter Podcast. He's got his peeps watching on there.
Battles and Banter, how we doing?
And my brother from Times of Another, Mr. Patrick McGuire.
Thank you.
History Things with Pat. So thank you guys for coming out and being part of this.
Real quick before we continue, actually, I want to say thank you to John, not only for having us back, but this is actually the 1-year anniversary of John starting the Tattooed Historian Presents series. So today is the day where we say thanks for putting on this speaker series.
Thank you.
It's been awesome, man, and I'm honored to be a part of the ride.
And thank you for being the Gandalf to the rest of our Frodos. You know, you really led the way. You know, with
Wow.
this
Some
is
of
a-
us are Sam.
This is a fellowship of historians, and but seriously, John, like you've done so much to help people like me who are getting getting themselves off the ground, at least in this history field. So, kind of doing something different, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
man.
big thank you to you,
Yeah,
John.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I did not pay them to say that. So thank you. Thank you,
You
fellas.
could.
I appreciate that. I could.
Yeah, you can Venmo me. You know.
Oh, yeah. I'll talk to you later about that. No, thank you, guys. And it was very important for me to start these a year ago because I wanted to give everybody something to come to, an experience that's free and available for all of you to come out and hear a little bit of history in the evenings, especially when there's hardly anything to do sometimes in the evening, especially on a Thursday evening. And I just like having it to where there's no cover, there's nothing. You can just come out to the pub and have a good time and have a good, enjoyable experience. And I hope that those of you who have come to some or watched some online, or this is your first one, I hope you get something out of each one because I know that a lot of people that I bring up here put in a lot of hard work. And I know we've had everywhere from PhDs to, people who just graduated high school and just are history nerds. It's just the way I like to do it. I like to have an inviting environment for everyone who's involved in the field in some way, who can footnote their history and who can also be a little entertaining and educational at the same time. So that was what I wanted to try to do. So
It's a footnote.
not trying to plug myself. I just want to. It's a very long explanation.
You got to know why we're here. It's its own history lesson, guys. That's
Yes.
the
That's
first
right.
one of the night. First of many.
For sure. Yeah.
There you go.
All right.
But yeah, tonight, WTF Moments in History, and as some of you may remember, I had to follow Pat last time, and I hated doing that because he had such good stuff. So I am not following Pat tonight. I'm going to make Avery follow Pat.
All right.
So Pat, you are up
Challenge
first,
accepted.
my friend, with the first story.
All right, thank you guys for having me. I'm Pat McGuire again. For those of you who don't know me or weren't here the first time, I host the social media, historical adventure, history things with Pat on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So I appreciate you if you're following, and if not, stop by, check it out. It's pretty cool what we're doing, and I hope to sort of get more people involved like John does, with this hobby here. So the first story I'm going to tell tonight is actually not from the American Civil War, and that's, if you know me, that's sort of the thing I get pigeonholed into the most. I started my platform as a Civil War platform only, and over the years I've kind of grown into the other interests I have as a historian and things like that, and have broadened. So I'm gonna actually do my first non-Civil War interpretation for you guys here tonight. So the first story I tell is going to come from the Great War, the First World War, and we're going to talk about a story from early, and it's actually a story some of you guys might be familiar with. But the theme of it, being a WTF moment, is kind of one of these outside-the-box WTF moments. I'm going to focus on the humanity of part of the First World War. So when you think of the First World War, you're definitely not thinking of the humanity. We're talking about a war that's known for industrialized killing, literally turning the ground into an alien landscape that if you visit it today, you can see very realistically the scars of the 19 teens that were left there. So humanity is not something that comes to mind when you're thinking of shelling and gas attacks and trenches and hand-to-hand fighting and no man's land. So, this is a war that's also defined by its staggering casualty counts. When we cover the American Civil War, we do a lot of this focusing on the death and the casualties. Here at Gettysburg, we do this analogy of similar numbers to the entire Vietnam War in like 3 days, or we just observed the Antietam anniversary, which is 23,000 Americans killed, wounded, or missing on a single day. So for some context for the First World War, that's a jarring number actually. Before we get into that, and a little earlier in the same century before that, Napoleon's going to boast, that he could spend 30,000 lives in a day. And these are like that boast, that brag from Napoleon is huge because it means like I don't care. These numbers, they're super important, but I can afford it. And we're talking only 30,000. So at the beginning of the First World War, by the end of the first month, we're gonna be talking hundreds of thousands, not 20,000, not 20,000 here, 10,000 there. We're talking hundreds of thousands of just French casualties, and then there's hundreds of thousands of British casualties, and there's hundreds of thousands of Russian and German casualties separately. So we're talking close to 1 million casualties in the first month and a half of the war. Now, casualty, as we know, doesn't always just mean killed outright. So we're talking wounded or missing, things like that. So that's what we think of when we think of the First World War, is that kind of stuff, not this humanity. So the Archduke is obviously assassinated in June, of 1914, and about 5 months later, we're entering the first holiday season of the war. So we're going to talk about the Christmas truce of 1914, which is a story some people might be familiar with here. So leading up to this, there's a lot of the staples of the First World War are already on the field, literally and sort of figuratively. We have the artillery is already there and present. It's chopping up the land. We have a no man's land. Trench systems. I don't think we've hit the gas phase yet. I think that comes in 1915. But, all the basic hallmarks of the war are already there. But we're still observing some of the kind of rule-based warfare, and even if they're unwritten rules, there's still some civility in the combat, like breakfasts. There's not a lot of action going on during normal breakfast times because we know they're eating breakfast and we're eating breakfast, and who wants to mess up my eggs?
Don't interrupt breakfast.
Yeah, so there's like some of that stuff is still going on. And as we know, as the war progresses, that stuff disappears, and this becomes like an utterly inhumane kind of concept to follow. So the humanity inside of the inhumanity is kind of the WTF here. So about a month out, we have Pope Benedict is going to issue a kind of like plea for just peace. Like, we're heading into the sacred holiday season, guys. We want to kind of just knock this shit off. Can I just get can I get an amen? Can I get just like a quiet moment here? And all of the commands on all these sides are like, no, this is a war. You don't win wars by not attacking and flanking and moving. So officially, there is no truce coming. There is a war on, and we're fighting it still. But as you get to about 4 or 5 days out, maybe a week out from the actual Christmas season, the soldiers will note on both sides of the trenches that there's like a literal change in the air. Like that peace on earth and goodwill towards all is kind of prevalent. People can feel it, and there's no reason for it other than they haven't truly settled into what this war is going to become yet. There's still this idea that we're very close to the end, so it's okay to kind of drift away from your madness and enjoy your Christmas or your Hanukkah or things like that. So with this, you'll start to see a little shift in the action on the Western Front. On Christmas Eve specifically is when these truces start to kick off. So you have, hot mic.
You are hot now. Yeah.
Super hot. So on Christmas Eve of 1914, you'll have this kind of culmination of this weirdness. The week preceding it, there's like Germans that are popping up over the lines and they're juggling and they're smiling, and there's British guys kind of playing cards right on the parapet and not really getting shot at because people are not really trying to ruin their peace. It's just not something that we haven't descended into the madness yet. So Christmas Eve, 1914. French soldiers on the Western Front are going to start seeing weird lights in the woods across from them, across no man's land. And they're going to be really intrigued by this because right after they start to notice these lights, the German caroling is going to kind of erupt from the woods. And, if you've heard, they sing, the Germans start singing Silent Night, Stille Nacht. It's, it's something that you might not know the words, but you know the tune. So all the French soldiers sitting on the other side of no man's land are like, WTF, I know this song. And, and this is not to say that these same instances are like they're not uniform up the Western Front, but you have these carols that are kind of going back and forth across no man's land. And as right at midnight, all these weird lights they see kind of get propped real prominently right up onto the parapets of the trenches. And this is a really weird sight. There's not a lot of popping going off. There's still reports that the Germans are shooting a little further up the line, but it's getting quieter and quieter. And as the night goes on, these candles that are burning on these trees are continuously burning. And as night gives way to day, the French start to see that there's some Germans up above the trench a little bit, kind of waist high. And they're like, holy shit. They're like, this is weird. Nobody's shooting. So they kind of pop up. And this kind of goes all along the line where they pop up a little more, and then suddenly everybody's kind of standing like just in no man's land or right on their trenches above it, totally exposed, and nobody's really shooting at each other. And they're going to kind of intermix and kind of remember that, the experience that they're going through in their own trench is the exact same experience that their enemy is going through in their trench, right? Because it's winter now in 1914. So the ground has been chopped up for 5 months. Men have dug down into the earth, and with that, you can't really leave because you're safe there. You stick a finger up, it could get shot off, which means you're going to the bathroom in this trench. All your trash is staying in this trench. It's raining. It's like a historically nasty rainy season that kind of starts, and then it's all freezing. So it's just like the worst of the worst, and your enemy's going through it too. And so for a moment, they can kind of stop and just, be humans. Let me show you my sweetheart. They're exchanging addresses. I promise to write, cigarettes, chocolates. There's even reports of soccer matches that take place.
Football.
Football. We're not involved yet. No Americans in 1914, so it's football.
Football.
But and then that's like a huge moment, right, of humanity that I like to focus on because some of these truces go on for a couple hours. Some of them don't happen at all. There are parts of the line that are really pissed off over the next couple days when they hear about this peace that took place because they were getting shot at and shelled all night. There are some parts of these truces that go on for longer than a day, a couple days. There are reports on January 10th of Germans sending up signal flares like, officers are coming, we're going to shell you, duck, and when we shoot the white flare, it's over, and the officers are gone, and it's this sort of like, we'll shoot high, you shoot high, because at the end of the day, this is a war like most wars that are fought by citizen soldiers, which means not everybody's a total professional. I will gather that there's more than one person other than me in this room that might not have a problem in a street or a bar fight, but you're probably not a killer. No. You might be able to throw hands to, knock somebody out, but you're not going to take somebody's life. And so this is a war where people that live maybe like that are also forcing themselves to be killers. So any chance you can not, they're going to not. So the Christmas truce of 1914 is one of those moments that I think in a war that's defined by its awfulness and bloodshed, where the WTF moment is actually humanity. And I think that's really cool. And that war has cool individual moments, like with, soldiers not being killed because they're just helpless. Adolf Hitler is one of the most humane stories out of the First World War. I mean, he's wounded and caught in no man's land, dead to rights by a British soldier. Yep. British soldier doesn't kill him because nobody knows that this is Adolf Hitler for 30 years, 20 years from now. This is just a Bavarian soldier who is just outright pitiful and wounded. So humanity took over there. So, and then the final twist on the WTF moment is that all the upper commands are not really happy when they hear about this. This isn't like, oh, I'm so happy you remembered to be good on Christmas. They're really pissed. They're like, how dare this whole thing? So they ensure for the entire rest of this war that there's going to be no future Christmas truces. There's going to be campaigns, attacks, counterattacks, artillery shelling, trench raids, anything you can think of to keep the armies moving and attacking. And this is right around the time where Churchill will note in his diary that this is sort of where the war has the forces take over. And the way I like to put it is that right now in the storyline of the First World War, men are dictating the war. But very soon, in the next few weeks, the war is going to start dictating to the men. And it's just going to be a series of reactions for the next 3 or so years until armistice in 1918. So my first WTF moment from the timeline of anything is actually there's humanity in all the wars we study. But the First World War, which is especially known for its violence and inhumanity, actually has some stellar moments of individual humanity and these major moments where it just kind of bursts through like a flood, like on a Christmas Eve and Christmas Day 1914, where your enemy, you could meet them on the field of battle and actually exchange pleasantries instead of lead. So that's my first story tonight, guys.
And the Germans do what they always do. If they don't like you, they send them to the Eastern Front.
True. And then the side note on that soccer match, I don't know the German regiment that was engaged in the soccer match that I guess is most noted, but I think the general understanding is that it's the Lancashire Fusiliers on the British side, and they lose 3-2, which is kind of a testament to where the World War is at the time. The Central Powers kind of got a little bit of a leg up with the Schlieffen plan.
Literally a leg up.
So that's my WTF moment is humanity inside of awful inhumanity, because that's not something you think about a lot when you think of the war.
Well, I guess I'm next, huh?
You are next.
Well, that's actually good, because I don't think I can top you, but it's a good segue because this story is going to take place during the same era. So you had already mentioned that we're not in it yet. The United States is not going to join the war until about mid-1917. So what are we doing during all this? Well, we are going about our lives, and we're dealing with different issues within the United States at the time, one of which is polio epidemics, because that's a load of fun. And in the summer of 1916, there are two battles going on the eastern front, or on the western fronts of World War I that are just chomping up men in the tens of thousands every day. You have the Somme for the British and the Verdun for the French, and Germans are at both. And while that horrific carnage is happening, people are vacationing like crazy in the United States. There's this real breaking out of vacation industries that's breaking out in the early 20th century. We didn't really go on vacation as people, or as Americans, I should say, until the 20th century. We started going to beaches, and we started going to national parks before they were even parks. These people wanted to look for what was called the picturesque. And so a lot of people are going to the ocean for that picturesque. But in the summer of 1916 especially, they are going to the beach because it's just frickin' hot. You're looking at temperatures between...
It's hot here.
Yeah, I know. Kind of like what we dealt with this summer, but in 1916 with all those big dresses and the trousers and the top hats. And oh, wow, I can't even imagine. But that's why people are going to the ocean. And our story is going to take us to the Atlantic coastline of New Jersey. And in the summer of 1916, that coastline is going to get rocketed by a horrific situation. How many of us are familiar with my all-time favorite movie and book, Jaws?
Yes.
We're familiar with Jaws? I know I see some hands back there. Okay, well, this story.
It's going to need a bigger boat.
I know. This story is what inspired that book, what inspired Peter Benchley to write that book, and what the movie then, of course, was also inspired by. The movie actually mentioned it. It is the shark attacks of the Jersey Shore in the summer of 1916. Between July 1st and July 12th, 12 days, 5 people are attacked, and 4 of them are killed. Now, the first victim is a guy by the name of Charles Van Sant. He's a 25-year-old son of a doctor whose family had gone to Beach Haven, New Jersey. I've been to Beach Haven. It's a good time. We're going to leave it there.
Jim Tan Laundry, Jersey.
Beach Haven is where the Van Sant family is going to be vacationing for Independence Day, for the 4th of July. We go to the beach for the 4th of July. And while everyone was back at the hotel, Van Sant, Charles, 25-year-old Charles, decided he was going to go for a sunset swim. Now, for those of you that watched Shark Week, you know a prime feeding time for sharks in the shallows is at dusk or dawn. Charles Van Sant does not know this. And this is setting kind of the scene for what people really know about sharks in this time period, which is nothing. The idea that there's people out there at this time who think sharks are absolutely harmless. A famous athlete in 1896, his name is Herman Olbrechts. Is that how? Anyone ever heard of Herman Olbrechts? He was a very famous billionaire athlete. And he actually tried to prove both times that sharks were harmless by just jumping into shark-infested waters in front of large crowds. He did it off a pier near Beach Haven, and then he did it off his private yacht. Both times, no shark attacked him. And it just awed and astonished audiences, and it created a false sense of security. Now, if I could travel back in time, I'd tell them, like, yo, man, sharks are not natural-born man-eaters for sure, but I wouldn't underestimate their ability to mess your day up at all. And so with that in mind, Charles Van Sant is treating the Atlantic coastline as a swimming pool, as many people did. And he is only in about 6 feet of water, 50 yards from shore, when he is hit at 6 o'clock from under the water. And people at first thought he was joking around. He had been swimming with a dog, and people had seen shadows moving towards him, and they thought maybe a school of fish, but maybe it's something else. We should get his attention, but he didn't see it in time. One of his friends was a lifeguard at Beach Haven at the time, a guy by the name of Alexander Ott. Actually has a bunch of volunteers make a human chain to go out to him to grab Van Sant, because they can see him 50 yards. It's half a football field. That's not very far at all. And so as they pick him up under the armpits and start dragging him to shore, as they get shallower, the shark is still attached to the dude's leg. And it's a conical snout, which from the historian's account puts it at about a 7.5-foot great white shark, which is juvenile. And a lot of juveniles are born in the waters of Cape Cod and then migrate back south. So that's probably what was going on there. And he just, it happened to cross paths with poor Charles Van Sant. But he eventually lets go and takes most of Van Sant's right leg with him, down to the bone. Thank God his dad's a doctor, because he's never going to make it to a hospital in time, but the dad brings him to the hotel they're staying at. They try to stabilize him, but there's just too much blood loss, and he does die around 6:45 p.m. That's July 1st. Anniversary of Gettysburg, I know. And
Somme.
I know. And, yeah, what's going on at the Somme, too.
60,000 men died that day.
One death, and this rocks the coastline. But there's not an initial panic yet, because people are like, oh, this was a freak fluke incident. Nothing like this ever really happens. And people are very skeptical that it even is a shark. And that brings us to the next victim. About 5 days later, on July 6th, is a man by the name of Charles Bruder. He's 27 years old. He's a Swiss bellhop at the Sussex and Essex Hotel at Spring Lake, New Jersey. I don't know if that building's still standing or not. I've never been to Spring Lake, so I don't know. But, yeah. And Charles Bruder... Charles Bruder...
Ocean City.
Oh, is it? Okay.
We don't know.
Okay. Charles Bruder is a long-distance swimmer. He and the other bellhops did, like, thousands of yards out into the ocean almost every day. And he's on his lunch break around midday on July 6th when he decides to go for a swim. Now, whereas Van Sant was close to shore, only about 50 yards, he is going to... Charles Bruder is going to be a whopping... where is it? Sorry. 1,000 feet nearly, which is about 300 yards. That's far. That's way further than I would ever be comfortable being at the ocean. I would sort of, but that's us today, and that's my point exactly. We would say, hell no. But to Charles Bruder, that was nothing. Well, and what happens next is that people on the beach look out, and they see Bruder basically leave the water. Like he's thrown, clear out of the water. And then they see something red appear. And women on the beach are saying, lifeguards, lifeguards, that gentleman in the red canoe out there capsized. Bruder wasn't in a canoe, and it wasn't red. It's just the amount of blood from 300 yards away. Yeah. So two dudes in a canoe, or a rowboat, they get out there to him, they pull him into the boat, and he ain't got no legs. They're gone just above the knee. And he is dead before they even get back to the shore. Now, at this point, a panic is setting in. Now it's been 5 days, and we have 2 people dead from a shark attack. Nobody really thinks it's a shark. In fact, probably one of the darkest, funniest things I read while researching this. So, New York Times is reacting to this. And a lot of newspapers are reacting at this time. And people are looking for a culprit. Some people are saying could not have been a shark, but mostly probably a killer whale. They are known to be aggressive and attack humans. What do we know about killer whales at the time? If you don't know much about sharks, I guarantee nobody knows that much about orcas either.
Just because it's called a killer whale.
I know, killer whale.
This is way before Free Willy.
I'm getting there. And another theory is from a guy by the name of Barrett P. Smith, who wrote into the New York Times on July 14th, a couple days later. And the letter is entitled, "Perhaps It Was a Turtle." He says, having read with much interest the account of the fatality off Spring Lake, New Jersey, I should like to offer a suggestion, somewhat at variance with the shark theory. In my opinion, it is most unlikely that a shark was responsible, and I believe it much more likely that the attack was made by a sea turtle. I've spent much time at sea and along shore, and have several times seen turtles large enough to inflict just such wounds. These creatures are of a vicious disposition, and when annoyed are extremely dangerous to approach. And it is my idea that brooder may have disturbed one while it was asleep on or close to the surface. That, I honestly laughed out loud for about 5 minutes.
Those pesky turtles.
And I'm like, that's like the next great sci-fi original movie on Sci-Fi Channel.
Shark turtle.
Anyway.
Shell shock.
Anybody?
Yes. New project, John.
Well done. Well done.
I'll be here all week.
I know. And one of my favorite theories, and I'll save that one for later, is that somehow the Germans are involved. But this is not the end of it. What probably the craziest WTF moment of the whole story is that we had 2 attacks on a shoreline. And, us as people now, we know that's pretty, it happens. Rarely, but it happens. Well, the next attacks come on July 12th in Matawan Creek, outside the town of Keysbury, New Jersey, which is just inland from the Raritan Bay. So, to give you a quick distance mileage here, Beach Haven, Spring Lake is 45 miles. From Spring Lake to Matawan Creek inland, that's 30 miles. And so on July 12th, it's a estuary, Matawan Creek. It's an estuary to the Atlantic. It empties into Raritan Bay. And when the tide comes in, as you probably are very familiar with, salt water comes in. And there had been a full moon the night before. So according
Werewolves.
to... Werewolf Sharks, another sci-fi movie. But anyway... because of the full moon, scientists think that the salinity in the estuary was very, very high. So even a saltwater shark could survive there for at least a couple hours or so. It's around mid-morning when Thomas Cottrell, who is a local fisherman, is fishing off a bridge over Matawan Creek. And he's got a bobber in the water, and he looks below him, and he just sees an 8-foot-long shadow cruise underneath the bridge. And he's like, well, that's a shark. So he goes back to town and tells everybody, we got a shark in the creek. And everyone's like, no way. Absolutely not. It's a creek. We're nowhere near the ocean. It's 12 miles that way. No way. There's no way a shark swam all the way up here. And remember, nobody knows anything about sharks at the time. Well, a couple hours later, a group of boys are going down to what's called the Wyckoff Dock. One of them is 11-year-old Lester Stillwell. These boys worked at a basket factory in the town. And they were taking their lunch breaks. And it was, of course, a very hot summer day. They go do what boys do. They cool off, and they, jumped into the creek. And within about 5 to 10 minutes of entering the water, the other boys saw what they thought was a log floating towards Lester. And then that log sprouted a fin and then darted. And before they could even react, Lester Stillwell is grabbed and dragged underwater. The other boys freak out, of course. They run back to town screaming for help. They're stark naked because they skinny dipped at the time. And so, I can't imagine being the townsfolk being like, my God, what are these children screaming about? Lester Stillwell's dead, that he's had some sort of attack, that a shark's attacked him. Lester Stillwell was also epileptic. So most of the adults are thinking he must have had a seizure and probably drowned, and the boys, whatever. So a local tailor, a guy by the name of Watson Stanley Fisher, he's 24 years old. He's a strong swimmer. He and a bunch of other men come out to the creek, and they decide they're going to look for Lester's body. He must have drowned. Watson Stanley Fisher dives in, and within a minute, he surfaces with Lester's body and is immediately attacked again. And he is attacked on the bank, like the shark is beached itself with Watson in his mouth. And he's got a crowd, and everyone can see the craziness unfolding below them. And, people, of course, after the shock subsides, they react. They beat the shark with an oar till it finally lets go, but, of course, takes a big chunk of his thigh with him, severing his femoral artery. They take him to the hospital, but he dies an hour later. This is the same day. 2 people dead in a day inside Matawan Creek. Now, back downstream, about, I think it was 30 minutes after this attack, you have 14-year-old Joseph Dunn and another group of boys swimming off another pier. And they can hear, franticness coming from town. They're like, the hell's going on? And an old man was passing by and says, you boys need to get out of the water now. There's a shark in the creek. And, of course, if you're, a kid at the time, you're like, what? No thanks. Well, literally as that's happening, Joseph Dunn's brother saw the fin pop up coming at him. So they all swam to the dock. They get to the dock. Joseph Dunn's the last boy on the ladder, and he gets grabbed in the leg. Now, his brother jumps in, 2 other of his friends jump in, the old man that was passing by jumps in to pull him from the shark's jaws, and Joseph Dunn is going to make a full recovery by September of 1916. He's the sole survivor of these strings of attacks. After this happened, the town around Matawan Creek loses its marbles. People come back to the creek in the next 2 days with shotguns, dynamite, fishing nets, and they're throwing everything. Just like Jaws.
Related?
Isn't this sounding familiar? But this is a creek. This is an estuary, but it's a creek. And this is crazy to think about. This is happening inland. Like, we have creeks around my house, and I'm telling you, when I first heard this story many, many years ago, I was getting my scuba certification in a creek. And I'm telling you, when we dove deep, it was a 30-foot deep creek, too, by the way. And I was like, my God, I'm not scared. I'm not scared.
There's reports of sharks in the Potomac.
Yeah, I know.
When I was living down in D.C., had a guy who was like a lifer down there, and he's a coastie with the Coast Guard, and he would tell you that, like, they'll see dorsal fins in the river that are clearly not dolphins or anything. They are sharks.
I'll believe it. Anything that empties out to the
sharks,
bay
but they see them all the time, and they see them sometimes up as high as around Fort Washington, so very close to the district. So,
yep.
stuff
And
like
that brings me to my closing points here. So a couple days after this, on July 16th, they find Lester Stilwell's body. That same day, President Woodrow Wilson has a cabinet meeting to discuss these shark attacks. He says, we're going to give whatever aid we can to apprehending the shark responsible. Well, in about...
Put him in cuffs.
I know, right? From
Forget the war. We have a
thanks,
shark.
President Wilson. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah,
I know,
that's
right?
Wilson,
I love Woodrow Wilson. That's sarcasm. Anyway, point is
Wah,
that
wah.
in the days that follow, a whopping 2,000 sharks are caught in like 5 days. People go absolutely crazy. And it's very, 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 very absolutely likely that many sharks were not responsible for these attacks. But it's on July... Where are we at? July 14th, 2 days after the Matawan Creek, out in Raritan Bay. Gentleman, because I got to look at his name, I can't pronounce it. Michael Schleicher, who was a taxidermist and lion tamer with Barnum and Bailey, was fishing in his rowboat with a friend. They had a net, and swimming into their net was an 8-foot great white. And the shark struggled, nearly pulled the boat under, but they beat the hell out of it until it was dead. Dragged it to shore, took pictures of it. Doctors later cut it open and pulled out human remains. So, now we have 5 attacks. We have a shark with human remains in it that was swimming away from the last site of attacks. We think we got our killer. This breeds the whole rogue shark myth that has perpetuated our pop culture and for a long time the science behind sharks for many, many years going up in through the 20th century. Recently, though, a lot of marine biologists have said that that is a myth. There's no such thing as a rogue shark. Newest evidence has said probably Bruder and Van Sant were attacked by completely separate sharks, and that the shark definitely, we did have a shark that was in the creek attack. It's the same shark that hit Stilwell, Fisher, and Dunn, but that's also you got one shark in a small body of water. It's just like tempting fate. But the point is that this story gets name dropped in the movie Jaws. Hooper and Brody are talking to the mayor and giving him examples of moments when you have a rogue shark before, and they mention Jersey Beaches in 1916. And so, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the hysteria behind these attacks is probably the biggest WTF to me. One theory, and this is one I saved for the end, is that Germans were using U-boats to lure sharks closer to shore to attack Americans. Not kidding. That was in newspapers, and that was in news bulletins and everything. And it just created more anti-German sentiment to get us ready to go to war in 1917 and 18.
Yeah.
And these shark attacks were part of that propaganda.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is probably one of the craziest things. But, Jaws is still my favorite movie. And I love sharks. I love to conserve them. And by no means do I think that they are man-eaters at all. But this is probably one of the most fascinating stories about it because it inspired all of the pop culture. Any shark movie you've ever seen is probably due to this event in history. The hysteria, the pop culture behind killer sharks came from the summer of 1916.
I'm glad you told this story before I went or after I went to the beach. That's terrifying.
It's okay. As long as you're in a group, we'll go together. It'll be fun.
Yeah, no, thank you.
They stopped eating when you started telling the story.
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
A lot of people are dying in this story.
Yeah.
I know, but
Had to go
I'm
right
done.
for that one, didn't you?
So yeah, top that, John.
Yeah, that unrestricted submarine warfare just
I know,
took a
right?
whole new turn
Ridiculous.
with-
I mean,
now they're hiring sharks out. That's
of course they're
crazy.
German U-boats, you know.
Obviously.
U-boat captain.
Yes. So for my first one, I wanted to go back to the 19th century. Since we're in Gettysburg, that's kind of the way to go from time to time.
Yeah.
However, I went
expected.
back to the War of 1812.
Oh.
I've spent numerous vacations, I guess you want to call it, or trips to what I call Upper Canada, which is London, Toronto, Hamilton. So War of 1812 is really big up there. It's like the Civil War is here. You know, of course, you know they like to point out that they beat us, and
It's like they got the better end of that.
yeah,
deal,
they
for sure.
did good with our invasions.
Good
of
job,
that.
Canada.
So I wanted to come up with a WTF moment from the War of 1812 because it's just something that I'm starting to study more and more now that I'm going up there and seeing all of these sites where the American Army went into, Battle of Chippewa, Battle of Lundy's Lane, et cetera, et cetera. Winfield Scott cut his teeth in the War of 1812. So I actually went with something that occurred in August of 1814, in which many of you will know the first part of this story pretty well. And that is, there's a British invasion into Maryland, and they are trying to come basically to the back door to Washington, D.C. They come up through on August 24th. There's a battle called Bladensburg, and that's not too far from you. No. Steve Fan was here earlier. It's not too far. There he is. There's Steve Fan. in the back.
Steve, how you doing?
Not too far from Steve.
There wasn't enough force in 1814, were there?
No, there were not.
So you have the Battle of Bladensburg, which is basically a blowout. It's a rout of the American forces. Same day, the British Army marches right into Washington, D.C. President James Madison decides he's skipping out of town. He and his military officials, most of his cabinet and government officials, flee, leaving his wife Dolly behind to man the mansion, which now we call the White House. Obviously, back then it was the presidential mansion. So British troops are under the command of Robert Ross and George Cockburn. They enter the city, and they're using this almost as retaliation because when the American troops were in Upper Canada, they did some looting, and that's being nice. If you've heard of General Sherman in the Civil War, that's basically what we did to Toronto. We burned Fort York. We did some other stuff and this is kind of like a little payback. So coming through Maryland and coming up into Washington, D.C., what are they going to do? They're going to play with fire. And the British Army arrives and comes up Maryland Avenue in Washington, D.C. They arrive at the Capitol building. They set one side of the Capitol building on fire first. Then they set the other side on fire. They loot the Capitol. The Capitol at that time contains the Library of Congress as well as the Supreme Court. There are 3,000 volumes in the Library of Congress at this time. This is why later on Thomas Jefferson will give his library to the new Library of Congress because the original was burned down by the British.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, turnabout's fair play, I guess.
I know, right?
After they've successfully started burning the Capitol, and they have basically added fuel to the fire so it would try to burn all night long.
See what you did there.
Thank you. They turn up Pennsylvania Avenue, and now they're heading towards the presidential mansion. They strike the White House. Dolly is still in the White House just beforehand, and there's this whole great story that Dolly saves everything and does all this other stuff. Actually, she takes the servants and the slaves to save most of the items inside the White House.
Make sure you get the George Washington painting.
Yes, and there's a whole other story about the George Washington painting. But the soldiers arrive, British soldiers arrive after Dolly leaves. They burn the house. They also add fuel to that fire because they want that fire to go all night long too, so the people around Washington, D.C. can see exactly what's going on and see the destruction that's going on there. They burn the U.S. Treasury. They burn the War Department. They burn a bridge over the Potomac River. They just continue to burn all these different sites. Sorry, I'm getting a little feedback.
We're real rock and roll tonight. A lot of hot mics.
Yeah, no, it's like Jimi Hendrix in here. Sorry. Is that you or me? That's you.
Who knows?
Okay. Sorry.
Turn me off. I'm loud.
Okay, I'll turn you off.
I can bring out my Ranger voice.
Don't hold the ball to the microphone.
Yeah. So you have General Ross leading these troops up to that evening, after they burned the Treasury, the War Department, the Capitol building, the White House, General Ross sends troops to Greenleaf's Point, which is modern-day Fort McNair. And he sends these men there because there are 150 barrels of gunpowder at that location. So what do you want to do? You want to destroy that just in case the American military forces come back, the militia comes back. You want to get rid of all that. You have enough. You don't need that much. So he decides he's going to send out a work party to destroy these barrels of gunpowder. Well, they decide the best way to do that is to throw it down a well. So they're going to take these huge barrels of gunpowder and they're going to toss them down the well. Well, what happens is they start tossing them on top of each other, and one of them goes off. Huge explosion occurs. 30 British soldiers are killed almost instantly by this huge, powerful blast. And that pretty much ruins the evening for General Ross and the British Army.
Well, now the evening's ruined.
Right. Yeah. There goes the neighborhood.
Well, great.
Okay. So you have all these burning fires burning around the city. You have this conflagration now that's going on at what's now Fort McNair. And the British troops decide, well, we're just going to bed down for the night because we have to stay here till tomorrow before we can leave the city. Well, as they bed down, a storm front starts moving in. And they think, oh, it's just going to be a little rain, nothing to worry about, it's okay. Well, this is a large storm. So large and powerful that some meteorologists today and historians who are meteorologists say this could have been a hurricane that came up through exactly at the time the British are bedding down for the night and after all this trouble. A tornado appears up Constitution Avenue. There are British troops on sentry duty at the time.
This wasn't like X-Men or something?
Yes.
This sounds like
What
yeah,
is
X-Men
that?
history.
Yeah. Well, see, this is how history ties into popular culture. So a tornado drops down onto Constitution Avenue, rips up the middle of Washington, D.C. There are British troops who are being flung through the air. There are civilians caught up in it because there are civilians still in town. There are reports that they can see cannons flying through the air at this time. So this thing is a powerful, powerful storm.
And this is the story that inspired the 1996 film Twister.
Yes. Yes.
You gotta imagine they haven't seen this before. They're standing there. They're like, "What is that? Oh shit!"
Right. Yeah. You gotta imagine
I'm
like
flying.
this is the ghost of George Washington saying, "Get that crap out of my city."
Leave, British.
Or he was just an X-Men or something.
So George Cockburn, one of the British officers, is standing there watching this conflagration happen in front of him, and he's wondering what the hell is going on. What's going on now? Well, there's a female resident standing next to Cockburn. So he turns to her and he says, "Dear God, is this the weather you're accustomed to in this infernal country?" She replies, "This is a special interposition from Providence to drive our enemies from the city." And he replies, "Not so, madam. It is rather to aid your enemies in the destruction of your city." Well, the storm does two things. One, it scares the hell out of the British. And two, it puts out the fires. So that helps to save some things in the Capitol building. The staircases are saved and other interior components are saved. The shell is saved. So this completely extinguishes the fires. It damages the British ships so much that they say, we got to get the hell out of Dodge. They get back onto the ships and leave and head towards Baltimore, which leads to the Star Spangled Banner and the killing of Ross.
I
and,
see
and
you,
other
Francis
things
Scott
happening.
Key. What's up, Frederick
Yeah.
Maryland?
Hey, Frederick.
So the total destruction brought upon by the British alone is the Capitol building, Washington Arsenal, the dockyard, the Treasury, the War Office, the White House, a bridge over the Potomac, a frigate, and a sloop. It adds up to 365,000 pounds at that time, which is about $8.5 million today in damage. The British are in the city for less than 30 hours, and they get out, and they're like, we're done here. That's enough. Something weird is going on here.
No, thank you.
City of the damned.
We didn't know they had these kind of defenses, and they got out. And as we know, Ross gets killed by a sniper later on, and the bombardment in Baltimore, and that leads to Francis Scott Key becoming infamous and other things. But we talk about the burning as historians a lot because it's part of the campaign and the operational campaigns of the War of 1812, et cetera, et cetera. But we forget this little tornado that dropped down into Washington, D.C., and I think it's only one of 7 recorded tornadoes in the D.C. area, and I was at the last one. It was April of 2017. I'll never forget it because it's the first day we declared war on Germany in World War I. Yeah. We did the 100th anniversary, and I was in the Pentagon, and the tornado went right past the Pentagon, and I didn't even know it. Because the Pentagon's huge, you don't know what's going to happen. But that was the last. That was, I think, the last one they had.
John Heckman sitting there with his coffee, looking up
in my doughboy uniform. Yeah. This is not right.
Earlier in your story, when you mentioned like things don't go well for Ross here, I was like, things are about to really not go well for Ross.
Yeah.
He's about to catch a bullet.
You thought that was bad.
Yeah.
Wait till
Ross
you
does
die.
that later.
Jesus. So
yeah,
I love that story. That's a really cool one. My dad lives in the center of hurricane country, so I love hurricane stories. So like people unfamiliar with the weather and the British are like, "What the hell is this?" You know, like that's a super real thing. Yeah, I have a really authentic British accent.
That's
you can tell I cultivated it in Frederick, Maryland. So for my second story, I'm actually going to stick to my wheelhouse. You know, I started everything that I do as a public historian with the American Civil War, so I'm going to kind of tell you a story from the American Civil War now. And again, it sort of revolves around the humanity again in a weird way. Again, like that's not a thing you normally hear when you're talking about warfare is humanity, which I think in and of itself makes it kind of a WTF moment because you're not thinking about normal human traits. You're kind of just thinking about like, you know, vicious, hateful killing. So it's 1864, and we're at the Battle of the Wilderness. So this war's been raging for a good while. A lot of the
it's my favorite Civil War battle.
Do you want to tell the story?
No, you go. I
know you know it.
I'm sitting in anticipation.
Shh, no spoilers. So anyway, so where we're at is, you know, we're like deep into this war now. Like a lot of these major conflicts, especially like the one we're sitting here in Gettysburg, they're going to have played out. So when we get to the wilderness, we're back in an area where the armies have fought a lot earlier. These really thick, kind of dense quagmires of just trees and brush, and it's insane to move a lot of guys through. And when they were moving a lot of guys through earlier, we're talking like 80 to 90,000 Federal soldiers against like 30 to 40,000 Confederates. But now it's 1864. We have 130,000 Federal soldiers roughly in the area up against like 60,000, 70,000 Confederates in the area. So we have even more people in this kind of nasty area. And while this battle's raging, you have other things unrelated to this story like brush fires. So in addition to the guy in front of you shooting at you, the entire area around you is on fire. But that's not even the story. That's a whole different thing. So here we're at one of the real clearings in the wilderness. We have very few spaces of actual clear land and ground. And so we're here at Saunders Field, which is one of these, you know, random openings in this forest, and kind of like the First World War, because there's this big space of open ground. A lot of shelling has taken place here. The ground has been chopped up. There's, you know, big cannonball blasts, things like that stuff going on. So while there's this massive infantry fight happening, you know, all the line infantry, the muskets, the rattle of all that gunfire is going on, there's all the obvious chaos is happening, and there's a section of the Union line that's slightly being overran. So one Federal soldier drops himself into one of these shell holes to kind of just avoid being captured. And sort of in the same moment, this Johnny Reb guy drops himself into the same shell hole because there's a whole lot of lead flying at him. He's like, oh, shit. So these two guys end up in the same hole, and they're unaware for about a minute that they're in the same hole. And then, as you would expect opposition to do when they're in the same hole, these two guys kind of start jawing at each other. There's a lot of trash talk. But like I kind of mentioned,
guys.
Yeah. What are you doing here? So as I mentioned in the first story, right? Like there's a difference between being like kind of a machismo tough guy, I'll fight you, versus like I can kill you. Like I'm very confident in the ability to box somebody, but I really don't think I could take somebody's life. And so I think the average citizen soldier kind of lives this life, and what makes them exceptional is they are forced to cross that line. I don't think most of us can cross, or we don't think we can cross until the Army tells us we have to. So these two guys are doing a lot of trash talking, and because there's still some manners and civility in warfare, which is weird to say at the time, these two guys who are probably tired of the killing but not liking each other kind of challenge each other to a fight. Fine, we won't shoot each other, we'll box it out. Loser goes home as a prisoner, and these two guys accept the odds. They're like, fine, challenge accepted. let's go. And so these two guys just start to wail away in like your average boxing match you could think of, stand-up fighting, and all this is going on. And meanwhile, there's a battle happening. There's explosions and men dying and screaming and all this crazy stuff going on, and people start to kind of notice there's a fist fight happening here. So now imagine you're in fourth grade and a fight has erupted on the schoolyard. What happens? Everybody crowds the fight. So this infantry fight starts to break down. It stops kind of happening. People just start drifting over to this fight. They're like, what the hell is this? And they just watch. And you have several hundred guys from opposition, Federal and Confederate, standing kind of intermixed and around each other, just like, yeah, they're cheering their guy on.
What are you guys doing? We're watching this over here.
Yeah, it goes on. What does it say here? It says it goes on for like 15 or 20 minutes. And actually, I didn't do you the service here. It says that these two guys ended up bantering. That's how they got started. I wanted to throw that to you. So these guys are fighting now. And as you could imagine, this fisticuffs goes on for like 15, 20 minutes, which if anybody's been in a fight, that's a long fight. That's a super long fight. And eventually the Confederate soldier throws a pretty good haymaker and knocks the Union soldier down. He asks him, Billy Yank, if you had enough, and he's like, yeah. Because not only have I been shot at for a while, but you just decked me and my bell's rung. So, but true to his word, he gives himself up as a prisoner, and they kind of walk off the line. And as they get to the rear of this whole sort of situation, anybody who's seen the movie Wayne's World with the cars, they're kind of like, game on, and the war just kind of starts again. And like the bullets start to fly, and it's just kind of like everybody was kind of like, yeah. And so when I say like we're focusing on the humanity of that, like people were tired of the killing, and people are looking for any moment they can to kind of stop doing it. So in the middle of this battle, they're like, well, look at these assholes, and they just kind of watch, because it's way safer than continuing what we're doing. But
I want you to know that Game On is now seared into my brain. Anytime we go to the wilderness from now,
Game On. Yeah. Basically, in the middle of the battle, they're like, car, and they go and watch. So it's just one of those things. But I love that story because it is full of human character traits in it. We're curious, we're spectacle driven, we're ridiculous. In the middle of a blood fight, these guys are like, let's box. It's just completely ridiculous. And as Avery told a wilderness story the first time with Lee almost getting captured, this wasn't just a fight with silliness. This is a really major fight at the end of this war. We're not talking tide necessarily turning, but there's still some pretty good weight behind the Confederate Army and its movement at the time. So this isn't we can afford this silly little moment. The Federal Army just, they still have to win the war. So this moment kind of right there is interesting to me because it's kind of human. Everybody's just kind of like, enough. We've done this for 3 years. Let's watch these guys. And then when it's over, they're like, all right, back to work. And it's, so I love that story. So it's a shorter version than the World War I story, but you don't get to hear, especially here in Gettysburg, where we focus on this battle, especially in the Civil War in general, we're not listening to these weirder stories. We're talking big flanking movements, logistics of, I was driving in here through Westminster, and I passed 3 or 4 historical markers, and they're all about armies moving. There's no action here. It's just here they were here on the 30th. Here they were here on the 1st. Same guys from the last sign, here on the 2nd. Yeah. So it's we focus on that stuff. So here is this, kind of normal story that gets told, and I think that's pretty cool. You got 2 Civil War guys kind of just beating the tar out of each other in the middle of a real fight, and it's kind of just, it's a human thing. It's I'm done with this, but I still hate you. So anyway, so that's it. That's those are my WTF moments in history, man.
Well, I am very glad that you picked the wilderness, because
I know you love it.
Any chance to talk about the wilderness is always good.
I know you love it.
But I will shift gears, and this time we're going to hop to World War II. So we're still on a military note, but I don't know if I mentioned this when I started. Mine do have a theme, my 2 WTFs. It is man versus nature, and yes, you could say Jaws. There is another shout out for history in that movie. One that's very, very, probably one of my favorite monologues in the history of Hollywood is when Quint is telling Brody and Hooper the story of how he survived the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. So young, intrepid Avery a few years ago was like, I want to learn more about that. So I dug into it, and I've been digging into it for a few years. And I'll do book recommendation here at the end. But USS Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser. It wasn't even technically a battleship. It was a World War II cruiser. First got put into the ocean in 1931. Between 43 and 44, it served as the flagship for Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance. And it's seen a lot of action by this point. Now, if you're familiar with the story, you know that it's summer 1945, another summer story. And there's a lot of stakes here. You know, Germany has surrendered by this point in Europe, but Japan is not showing any sign of surrendering. And at this point, we have pushed Japan back to the Ryukyu Islands where Okinawa is. There's still a ton of Japanese soldiers in China, on Taiwan, in the Philippines. There's really not an end in sight. So it's around the summer of 1945 that the Manhattan Project is nearing its completion. We're contemplating dropping these atomic bombs on Japan, somewhere on the home islands. And so it was so top secret. I mean, this is a big deal. This is the first major atomic weapon that's going to be utilized against a civilian population somewhere in the history of man. And so for this purpose, the Indianapolis is chosen to deliver the components of the Little Boy bomb, which is the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. They left port in San Francisco on July 16th, and they set a record, a speed record of 74 and a half hours from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor. An average speed of 29 knots, I guess. I don't do knots.
They were hauling ass. That's how you
33 miles
translate
per
that.
hour for a ship. That's fast.
You land over you.
Thanks. They're carrying, I don't know the exact weight, but their cargo hold is filled with enriched uranium.
A lot.
Half of the world's supply of enriched uranium
not dangerous.
is aboard the ship. No, not dangerous at all. Especially when the boiler room is like
Totally safe.
3 rooms down. But nevertheless, from Pearl Harbor, they go to Tinian. They reach Tinian by July 26th, and they deliver the bomb. Or at least the components of it. That's where it's going to be assembled. And then from there, the Enola Gay is going to fly it to its target. And so from there, the ship is supposed to, advertise its voyage as just a routine kind of sloop. It's checking in on all the U.S. bases. We've grabbed the Mariana Islands by this point. And so their next destination was a brief stop at Guam, and then from Guam, they're headed to the Philippines. They're crossing the Philippine Sea, which, for the purposes of the story, is one of the most shark-infested waters in the entire ocean of the Pacific. So, also, a little tidbit is that because they had a top-secret mission, they're not a part of an escort group. They're not part of a strike group. They're alone. They're a solo ship, and that is very risky, traveling alone in Navy terms. But in the evening of July 29th, it's a Sunday. I know.
Navy terms.
Navy terms.
Navy terms.
Navy terms.
Navy things.
With a crew of about 1,196 men, the USS Indianapolis will be torpedoed by the I-58 Japanese submarine. And they were a few miles out from Guam, but they're about halfway to the Philippines when they get torpedoed. The vessel does go down in about 12 to 15 minutes because there was 2 impacts. The first torpedo hit kind of the middle of the hull. It damaged her, slowed her down enough that she started filling with water. The second torpedo hit right in the powder magazine. Ship left the water. It exploded so big. So of those 1,196 men, 300 are going to go down with the ship. 900 men make it into the water. And they did have lifeboats. Everyone's got a life preserver. They had a makeshift, it's like a cargo net. You sometimes see pictures of soldiers climbing down from a ship in a net. They have a bunch of those with flotation devices so you can hold on to the nets, and they float. And you have 900 bodies floating in oil slick, and fires are around them. The ship's going down. And they proved this on Shark Week. When a vessel sinks or a plane sinks when it goes down in the ocean, makes a lot of noise, makes lots of interesting sounds, a lot of vibrations. That's going to lure a couple of curious animals. Now, as I said, Philippine Sea is one of the most infested waters on the planet. And here are a couple of accounts from the sinking and the events that transpired afterwards. One is from Richard Stevens, a seaman second class of the USS Indianapolis. I said, "Buddy, you could hear it. It was just a rumble," talking about the explosion. "You could just hear everything blasting underneath the deck. It was just like fireworks. You ever hear fireworks when they push, push, and then all of a sudden, pa, 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 pa. Everything was exploding. That concussion just ripped that ship from one end to the other. Those were armor-piercing shells that were going off in there. Well, how in the world could that ship survive?" So the ship goes down 30 minutes, 900 men end up in the water. This account's from Jack Miner. He's a radio technician, second class, USS Indianapolis. He says, "What did I think about when I was in the water? I fantasized about meeting my parents at a dim roadside bar in the north woods of Wisconsin to share the story. And as the days dragged on, I thought less and less while I dreamed more and more. They're going to be adrift at sea for 5 days before planes even start looking for them. Because their mission is so top secret, they're not going to even be listed overdue for another week. And so nobody knows the ship's gone down. Now, they were supposed to check in. They were supposed to reach the port of, I believe it was Tlacoban, which is in Leyte, okay.
Leyte Gulf.
Leyte Gulf, yes. So they're supposed to reach that port by Monday, the morning after July 30th. And a guy sitting there to receive them is a guy by the name of Lieutenant, I gotta fast forward over here. Excuse me 1 second, because I didn't highlight his name. Of course I didn't. That's not it. It's okay, some lieutenant. Some dude
Moving on.
is supposed to receive the ship, and when it doesn't, his job is to alert his superior officer, hey, USS Indianapolis, it's not here. The Indy, as they called it, Indy's not here. He doesn't. He sits on it for 2 days and says, whatever, they probably just are slowing down. They were hustling all the way out to the Marianas. They're probably just taking their time. Meanwhile, back in the water, you have the guy's worst nightmares come to life on the dawn of that Monday, July 30th.
Real quick, before you
Yes.
descend into that, I'd just like to point out that how efficient the evacuation of the Indianapolis was.
Yeah.
Avery said 900 guys got into the water alive. Like, that's friggin' brilliant.
And most of that is to the credit of their captain, Charles McVeigh, I believe is his first name. Yep, Captain Charles McVeigh, who is probably someone I definitely feel the utmost sorry for reading this story. He really gets a raw deal. I'll get to that momentarily. But
Yeah.
a couple of these accounts around dawn on the first day says they stalked for hours, going around and around talking about sharks. And somebody said, hey, those must be PT boats. And another guy said, no, those are sharks. It's the wake they make. Finally, they attacked. They pulled guys right out of the water. We thrashed, trying to keep them away from us, but they came right into the group. Took the net and everything right up into the air. Tore guys' limbs off. The water was bloody. That's from Gus K., Seaman First Class, USS Indianapolis. There are a lot of different sharks in the Philippine Sea. I'm not going to get too much into a science lesson here, but you got the big contenders here. You got tiger sharks, the stripes. They are known as swimming garbage cans. They will eat literally anything and everything. They're not even just aggressive. They just don't care what swims into their path. You have blue sharks, hammerheads, which are my favorite. They look cool. You also, I know, shout out. I know, right?
The tiger shark, the honey badger of the sea, it just doesn't care.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Just truly
probably.
doesn't care. It's
Yeah, maybe.
whatever.
I don't know. Or the raccoon of the sea. I don't know. That's good. There you go. But you also had oceanic white tips, which they did a whole special, combined history and science, and said these guys are the killers of the Indy, of the men of the Indy. They suffered mostly from these sharks. They're not that big, but man, are they aggressive. And boy, do they hone in on shipwreck and plane crash survivors when they go down in the ocean. Another account is from a guy by the name of Seaman First Class Jack Cassidy, who was harassed so much by the same shark. It was a tiger shark, 12-footer. He's harassed by it. It will not leave him alone. He's named it Oscar. And the guys could hear him floating there saying, Oscar, F off. Oscar, F off again. Oscar, I'm going to kill you. You come near me again. Like, guys are hearing him say this. And finally, Jack Cassidy has a pocket knife, and when the shark swims close, he stabs it in its snout. Pulls it back. Shark's not even phased. It just keeps swimming. More just like, whatever, man. I'm going to eat you later. But Cassidy does survive. And probably another person I feel for is Dr. Lewis Haynes, who was the ship doctor. I think he was a lieutenant commander. I think it was his rank. But he probably gave me one of the most inspiring quotes here from his time at sea. So he's the doctor. He's in a raft with other guys who are, struggling to stay alive here. And he's saying, at first, you get in a situation where you abhor it. You can't stand it. It's terrible. But you can't get away from it. So you stick with it. And then you get so that you tolerate it. You tolerate it long enough, you embrace it. It becomes your way of life. And that was 3 days in. And most of the men dying are not from shark attacks. They're going to be dying mostly from a little thing called hypernatremia, which is over solidity of the blood. So if you just float in salt water for more than 3 days, more than 72 hours, you're gonna die. Like basically you just dehydrate your body just from floating there. Your skin starts to suffer from, I know a lot of big diseases names here, so just bear with me. Desquamation, which is just skin peeling. So guys' skins are literally just coming off because they've been in salt water so long. And that's what's driving them nuts. There's another crazy story from this where a bunch of guys, they just go stir crazy. You know, when you're dehydrated, when you're famished, when you're, suffering from hypernatremia and hypothermia too, because the ocean gets cold at night, obviously. All of that is going to really start to dive into the psyches of these men. And at one point, on the night of the fourth day, that was Thursday, men start freaking out, saying, "There's Japs in here. There's Japanese soldiers in the water with them." There were no Japanese soldiers. They're attacking each other. So a brawl breaks out. And then a murder fest. It's called the genocide of the Indianapolis survivors because these guys start drowning each other because they think the other is the enemy. By the end of the brawl, by the time officers could break it up, 50 men are dead. They just killed each other. So by this point on Thursday, that was in the morning, like dawn. By then, these guys start to look up and they start seeing these big Navy PBYs, which are these float planes flying over finally. They were doing routine flyovers, and they saw, oh, wow, there's a bunch of dudes floating in the water. What's going on? That was kind of the reaction to that.
That looks really weird.
So they radio that in, and they say, okay, mark their position. We'll get boats out there. And they said, no, screw that. We're picking up as many guys as we can. So they're going to land, and, they're going to start picking these guys up in droves as much as they can. But I think one of the big unsung heroes here is Captain Charles McVay III, because he was a leader through all of this. He kept his men going. He kept them calm, kept them in order as much as he could. Many times he said that he wished he had gone down with the ship. Ship's captain, that's what you're supposed to do. And men said, no, we'd be dead by now if you weren't here. So we're happy you're here, sir. And so they start getting picked up. By Friday, they fished out as many as they're going to fish out. About 316 survivors, 2 of which are going to die in a hospital in Pearl Harbor, I think, or maybe Guam. But yeah, that's out of 900 that went into the water. Only 316 come out. And so this is the worst U.S. Navy disaster in history. It still is. And there's a lot of finger pointing afterwards. And who do you think is the scapegoat for the Navy? McVay.
The guy that saved the most lives.
Exactly. McVay is going to be criticized for not zigzagging, which is a tactic you're supposed to employ as a ship captain to make it harder for the submarines to torpedo you. And in fact, in the aftermath of the war, on a committee that was created to exonerate McVay, the captain of the submarine, I-58, not even going to try to butcher his name, he actually was like, no, zigzagging would not have made a difference. I was going to sink that vessel. I had you dead to rights. You weren't missing. So when they couldn't clear him on that, then they said, oh, well, then you failed in, evacuating the ship properly. And like you said already, he got 900 guys off that ship out of a crew of like 1,196. That's pretty impressive. And so, I mean, the ocean's just going to take the rest. And it should be noted that this story, did get sensationalized, of course, afterwards. And I would say that when you get to Jaws, that scene with Quint telling that monologue, that's probably one of the scariest moments in the movie. Sure. And it's just, but like the history nerd in me was like, oh, fist in mouth. And that account that he says is true. There is the last tidbit here. You have a guy who wakes up next to his buddy, and he does appear to be asleep as well, so he swims over to him to wake him up. And when he nudges him, he upends like a top, and he had been eaten up to his life vest. So, and he may have already been dead, and these sharks were just scavenging on a body. We don't know, but this is probably truly a WTF moment, and it is nightmare fuel. I remember I had to put the book down late at night because I'm like, I'm never going to sleep tonight.
Never going in the ocean again.
I remember one of the worst nightmares I ever had was that I was shipwrecked at sea with not even a life jacket, just treading water, and that is like, oof. Sorry, you're all going to have a pleasant sleep tonight. But because poor Charles McVay, he lives the rest of his life till 1968. And even though the men stay close to him, the survivors, they, send him postcards every Christmas and say, I hope you're doing well, sir. The families of the men who didn't make it back send him different postcards, one of which says, our holiday would be a lot happier if you hadn't killed our son. And it all just builds and builds and builds on him until he goes out to his front stoop in 1968 with a toy Navy man and a revolver in his right hand, and he blows his brains out. And so fast forward a couple years later, a fourth grader in 1996, I believe it was, started doing a project on the USS Indianapolis, and he made such a convincing case in his project about how it's not McVeigh's fault that it got news recognition. The news started covering it, and then the military picked it up. The Pentagon was like, all right, let's reopen that case file. And in 2001, they cleared McVeigh of all charges. So he has been completely exonerated. It's a little too late for a lot of for his family, for the families of the men who were closest to him, because a lot of them say the same thing: he kept us alive. So as much as this is a WTF story, it's also to me a story of just perseverance, beating the odds. And I just love stories like that, because you think you're having a bad day, read these like this is a living nightmare, and that just gives you the motivation to keep going.
Surviving the Japanese was the easiest part of the story.
Surviving the sinking was the easiest part. Yeah, so that's my macabre, very downing. Sorry, everybody.
Those were awesome, buddy. Those were great.
It definitely, reading that is just like, my God, WTF, like stuff on that. But
the water ain't clear. I'm not getting in it.
Yeah.
Nope.
Like I said, we'll go together.
Patrick doesn't even get in bathtubs.
I know.
He's like, I'm not. No, thank you. All right, so I don't know if I can top that. I have. Pardon?
I said thanks for that visual, though.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
You're welcome. You're welcome, America.
You're welcome.
So I spent some time a few weeks back in Boston, and I was able to speak for the Boston National Historic Site, or National Historic Park, and it was a pretty awesome experience. It got me thinking about some cool things that had happened around Boston over the years, and things that we don't normally hear about, because we hear about things that go on at Fenway, and we hear about things that go on.
Go Yankees. Sorry.
No, stop.
Not sorry.
Stop. Just stop.
Guys.
We hear about we hear about Paul Revere, and we hear about all that stuff. We watch John Adams, but rewind the clock to the winter of 1919, and this is a really interesting story, a very sticky story, because it involves molasses.
See what you did there.
Yes. So north end of Boston at that time in 1919 is heavily populated by Italian immigrants. They're straight off the boat. They're first generation, and they're pushed into basically Italian ghettos in the north end of Boston. And in the north end of Boston is also the Purity Distilling Company. And the Purity Distilling Company is holding a large tank of molasses. Now, this tank is 50 feet tall. It holds 2 million gallons of molasses at one time. There's a photo that I found. Well, I didn't find it, but I saw it, where you can see this tank just towering up over buildings. It's a huge tank, and so you see these 1 or 2 story buildings, and here's this tank of molasses just there. Molasses is being converted into industrial alcohol at the time, which is munitions. We're just getting off the World War I era thing going on here. It's 1919. We're drawing everything down, but we're still getting in these imports from basically Puerto Rico and points south is where you get a large amount of your molasses intake. So molasses arrives at the port at Boston, which is just up the street from where this tank is housed, because you want it close by, because you don't want to transport a very long way. The railroad cars sit next to it, transport it to Cambridge. It gets made into industrial alcohol, then into munitions, and then to the military. So that's why there's this huge tank of molasses just sitting in the north end of Boston. It's not because everyone loves molasses and there's like a run on it now.
Not even syrup, it's molasses.
But this tank was built for the Purity Distilling Company, as I said, and it's done very quickly. And they build this thing up, and they basically say, we're not going to concern ourselves with, pressure. Don't worry about it. It'll be fine.
What does max capacity mean?
Right. Yeah.
It's not been invented yet.
It's fine.
Whatever.
It's fine. Just open a valve. It'll be fine. So the tank is built hastily. It's in this highly populated Italian neighborhood. Again, it's Italian immigrants, and sometimes, the immigrant population is like, oh, we'll put it in their neighborhood, because whatever. Structural tests are not completed at all, so they just build this tank up. Don't worry about it. As soon as they build it and they start putting molasses in it, molasses starts to leak almost immediately. Okay, so it's coming out at the seams. So much so the kids are going up with little popsicle sticks and twirling it up and making little lollipops out of them with all this stuff. So they think, well, okay, this is a problem. Yeah, totally sanitary. This is a problem. How do we fix this problem? So they go to what we would call corporate, and they say, which is what you do.
I need to speak to the manager.
Up the chain of command. Yeah, may I see a manager, please? Yeah. And they decide, well, we don't have to fix anything. All we have to do is paint it brown. If we paint it brown, no one's going to know the leakage. You can't see it.
Is that like the inspiration for Mick Jagger's Paint It Black?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's painted brown.
Cover your problems with the same color as the problem.
It was steel. It was a nice steel color. Now we're going to make it brown because you can't see the leakage. So guess what? That's what they do. They just paint it brown, and they call it a day. Also at this time, not only do you have the leakage from the tank constantly groans. Oh, no. From this pressure. So in the middle of the night, like now, we'd be trying to sleep, and you'd hear it start groaning because it's too full.
Is it going
and all this pressure's happening. Mid-January 1919, January 15th, temperatures rise very heavily in the morning. So you started to hear this
Thanks to Michael Winslow.
Thank you, yes. So the people in the area start to hear this groaning going on, and all of a sudden there's an explosion. And this tank literally implodes. And because of those temperatures rising so quickly, a large wall of molasses, 15 feet high, barrels down through North End Boston, covering everything in its path, taking debris with it, taking vehicles. It busts through the elevated railroad trusses, so that collapses. It takes the railroad cars with it. They had reported that they calculated that it hit the surrounding neighborhood at 50 feet per second. This thing is moving.
Yeah.
Very unlike molasses.
Moving. Yes.
Yeah, where's that?
That's a very uncharacteristic move here.
If you hear slow as molasses,
Molasses moves at
Not
50
true.
feet per second, just so you know
not
that.
true. It depends on temperature and pressure.
Molasses runs
So-
faster than Tom Brady. That's all
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Hey. Get off the dais. Anyway, so you have complete chaos. People are being caught up into this. They're drowning literally in molasses. People are being hit by debris that's coming through because it's like a wave of water
Like railroad
coming
cars.
down through there. So you're getting hit with all this debris. And then that night, temps drop so much that people, the dead, are now basically in like sugar candy. So throughout
Anyone still hungry?
Yes.
Remember how Jurassic Park started?
Yeah. Anyone want to see the dessert menu while we're talking about this? So throughout the evening, it cools down. This occurs. They have to go after the dead for recovery. They bring in saws and hammers and chisels to try to find people who have just been inundated by this molasses flood. Some bodies won't be recovered for a week. They find the body of a wagon driver 4 months later. Okay, there are 21 people killed by this incident, and it all happens in a blink of an eye. 15 feet high is like almost up to this window, barreling down the street here 50 feet per second. You can imagine there's no way to get out, no room to get out of the way. So, what happens with all this? There are over 100 lawsuits filed. Because we're going after the people who decided maybe we should just paint the thing brown. So the overall umbrella company is called the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company. They own Purity Distilling. They're going to get hit with 100 lawsuits, approximately. Over 100 lawsuits. The lawyers for the corporate people, if you want to call them that, tried to blame it on Italian anarchists. and said they bombed the tank.
We can't blame the Germans. They just lost. So
Right. So now we're going to blame the Italians. We're going to blame the Italian immigrants in there. They bombed it. The judge basically looked at him and said, "You're full of this. It's not going to. That's not going
judge
anywhere."
was Italian too.
Yeah. So the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company loses their case, and they had to pay $630,000 in settlements to families who had people lost or damages or anything like that. The really interesting part about this is that, you know, we sit here and we're like, wow, how the hell did this happen? And we kind of joke around about it being a sticky situation and all this other stuff, and puns start going. But this actually helps development because it increases the laws around development of land and development of neighborhoods. Zoning takes effect because of some of these issues. Building standards are increased. Obviously, if you're building a tank and it's already leaking and kids are like licking molasses out of your molasses tank, there's probably there's a problem. There was
that's why we have OSHA.
Also, for those of you who like drunk history, they did an episode on it, but I never saw it.
It's really good.
I can't watch it very long.
I know.
I can't do it. Just a shout out to there was Francine Pellegrino actually did an off-Broadway musical called Molasses in January. Not kidding.
I would.
There was no molasses.
She
actually said that they when the flood occurs, they drop the lights. People start screaming, and when the lights come back up, people are just laying there. So there's no molasses.
And freeze.
I petitioned that we put on that musical as historians.
Molasses in January. And Stephen Puello did a great book called Dark Tide, The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 based off of this too. So this is just a weird, wild story that occurs in the area where if we walk down, if we went along the Freedom Trail, it's not far from the Freedom Trail to this location where this is today. So when you go there, you can, I think there's like one sign to the molasses flood of 1919. But some weird thing that occurs because of the industrialization happening so quickly during the World War I era, building all this stuff up, and then you have a disaster, and you're like, maybe we should zone this differently. Maybe we should go with building standards.
Could you imagine being a doughboy and you just came home, you're like, I just experienced all that, but that's the weirdest shit I've ever seen.
Could you imagine?
Like I've seen war, but that was a tidal wave of like sludge.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's the inspiration for the Blob. Now, I know my themes have always been like pop culture being influenced by history. I wonder.
I don't know.
That's a good one.
I don't know, but imagine you have to go in there to recover the dead, and you have to use saws and chisels.
Suspension.
It's like House of Wax or something going on here.
Is there any notation on how long cleanup takes?
I didn't see any notation on cleanup, but what I did see was that one of the last bodies to be recovered was 4 months later, so we're talking April.
Over a couple.
And then they said they could smell molasses for months afterward because it's in every crevice of the street. It's in every crevice of the building.
It's part of Boston now.
Right, yeah. You probably smell it to this day. Who knows? But we just passed the 100th anniversary of it, the beginning of this year. So it's something that we tend not to think about with this great molasses flood. It's known also in historian circles as the Boston Molassacre.
Molassacre.
I am not making that up. I am not. I swear to God, I am not making that up.
Get out.
I made up shell.
You get off the dais.
But I did not make up
hosting
Boston
all night.
Molassacre. So, as we've said before in the WTF moments of the Civil War, we could go on and on and on with stuff. We won't do that tonight because we don't want to give you that many puns.
You got to come back.
And Avery with all these shark attacks going on because he watched Jaws like 3 nights ago.
He actually had different stories, but he was like, guys,
I'm going
sharks.
Going sharks, man.
It's not true. Not true.
But I'm glad to have the guys back up here with me to do this because this helps to showcase what we can do with history, and it's not just like organizational history of military stuff, or it's not whatever, It's us. We can be more laid back and we can be lighthearted about some things, even though they're talking about some very disgusting, dark things from time to time. The molasses flood was my lighthearted thing, even though whatever. But
people died.
Man-eating sea turtles.
Sorry,
it's the highlight of my
It's
night.
my dark sense of humor. But as was said earlier, it's been a year that we've been putting these on, and the Gary Owen has been so kind to us for
thank you.
allowing us to do
You
that.
guys are
Shout out, Gary Owen.
We only missed 1 month, which was December, because some of you, I wasn't going to do January, February, March because of the weather, and some of you called in and complained that we weren't doing them.
Good.
So thank you for that,
Keep
because
it
we got
going.
to do more. But we've had 11 great ones, and I hope we can do 11 more. And I'm so appreciative of all of you coming out month to month, or watching month to month, or catching up on YouTube month to month. It doesn't matter. Just however you consume it, thank you for consuming it. And I also want to thank these guys for the awesome stories, as always. And I think we need to do this like quarterly.
I'm
should.
in.
Just
I'm
to-
all in.
History is so full of like moments like this that we can definitely pull from it, and that's what makes it fun. Yes, these are dark, macabre stories at times, but man, when you discover them, you're just like, oh, I need to share this one. You know what I mean? Like you just want to run with it. And if you don't mind, so for anyone who wants to learn more about the things that I talked about the Jersey Shore shark attacks, not Jersey Shore. That's a different thing.
I mean, you can learn about
Shark
the
attacks
Jersey
at
Shore
Jersey
from
Shore.
Avery.
There's a book by Michael Capuzzo called Close to Shore. It's a really great read. It's a narrative read, so it's very fast-paced, but it's all researched meticulously. And then for the USS Indianapolis, I read Doug Stanton's In Harm's Way, which, yeah, it's a great book, but, yeah, don't read it before you go to bed. I'm absolutely serious. You're gonna be tempting fate for that one, but, yeah.
All I was going to say was I'm grateful that you brought us out. Thank you, John, for having
thank you, John.
for
You're
having
very
Avery and I out. And
You're very welcome.
thank you for helping to get some exposure for battles and banter and history.
Is that what you?
Yeah, yes. I also want to give a shout out to Dave here from TR Historical.
Hey, Dave.
Dave
What up,
here-
Dave?
Dave has some great stuff online for TR Historical, and I appreciate him carrying my stickers, and we're talking about hats, and we're talking about all kinds of stuff. He has some stuff here tonight, too. So talk to Dave on your way out if you would. Get some more drinks. Have a great evening. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you
have
so
been great.
much. We'll see you again.
Thank you.
Till next week.
Until next time, America.
Coming up, the guys take